What happens when a liberal professor tries to publicly humiliate a student she doesn't like, only to realize she's just challenged a genius? And not just any genius, a certified 170 IQ prodigy, Barron Trump. Trust me, by the end of this story, your jaw will be on the floor. At one of America's most prestigious universities, Dr. Anderson's advanced calculus class was known not only for its brilliant mathematical mind, but also for her increasingly obvious political agenda. As students filed into the lecture hall that morning, tension already filled the air. Instead of the usual complex equations, the whiteboard displayed a simple message: today's redefining academic priorities. In the back of the room sat a tall, quiet young man in a perfectly pressed black suit. Few of his classmates knew him personally. He preferred to keep to himself, but everyone knew who he was: Barron Trump. What they didn't know was that behind his reserved demeanor lay a mathematical mind that would soon shock everyone in that room. Dr. Anderson began her lecture, but something was off. Her usually confident stride felt almost aggressive as she paced before the class. Mathematics, she declared, while important, must make room for more pressing social discussions. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she outlined her new balanced curriculum. Barron's hand slowly rose. The professor's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't expected any challenge to her authority today. Dr. Anderson's lecture quickly morphed from a discussion of curriculum changes into something more revealing. In today's world, she continued with a hint of condescension in her voice, we need to focus less on abstract theories and more on real-world applications of social justice. The room fell silent as she pulled up a PowerPoint slide. Instead of the promised calculus material, it showed statistics about gender representation in STEM fields. Some of you, she said, her gaze drifting meaningfully toward certain students, might need to accept that your privileged position in this class doesn't necessarily reflect merit. Barron's hand remained raised, steady and patient. Other students began glancing at him, then at each other. A few nodded slightly, seemingly grateful that someone was willing to speak up. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Anderson couldn't ignore him any longer. Yes, Mr. Trump, she said, her tone a mixture of irritation and amusement. Do you have something to contribute to our discussion about privilege and education? Barron's voice was measured and respectful as he spoke. Dr. Anderson, I believe calculus is fundamental to understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us chose this advanced class specifically to deepen our mathematical knowledge. He paused. Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum potentially disadvantage all students, regardless of their background? Several students nodded in agreement, but Dr. Anderson's expression hardened. Mr. Trump, she said, emphasizing his last name, perhaps you could benefit most from understanding how privilege shapes our educational system. After all, not everyone has private tutors and elite prep schools. I'm not claiming to be an expert, Barron replied calmly. I'm just a student who loves mathematics and believes in its power to transcend political divisions. He gestured toward the pristine whiteboard. Instead of debating privilege, couldn't we spend this time exploring the beautiful complexities of calculus? The class held its breath. Dr. Anderson's eyes narrowed dangerously. She walked slowly to the whiteboard, marker in hand. Very well, Mr. Trump. Since you're so passionate about mathematics, let's put that passion to the test. She began writing on the board, her hand moving quickly as she crafted an equation that made several students gasp. A multivariable calculus problem involving complex integration and series expansion that even graduate students might struggle with. But what Dr. Anderson didn't realize was that she had just opened a door that would change everything. But Barron's expression remained unchanged, his composure unwavering. Of course, he said quietly, standing up, I'd be happy to try. As he walked to the front, Dr. Anderson's smirk widened. She'd chosen this problem specifically because it required techniques she hadn't taught yet. Techniques far beyond the scope of their current coursework. Yet something in Barron's calm demeanor made her smirk falter slightly. He took the marker she offered, studying the equation with genuine interest rather than the fear she had anticipated. A few students leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Before I begin, Barron said, turning to face the class, I notice this problem has multiple possible approaches. Would you prefer I use the standard method? Or would you be interested in seeing a more efficient solution? I learn best when I study Leibniz's original papers. Dr. Anderson's expression froze. "You've read Leibniz's original papers?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Yes," Barron replied simply, in German. The translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology. He turned back to the board, marker poised. "But perhaps we should let the mathematics speak for itself." The silence in the room deepened. Dr. Anderson's challenge had taken an unexpected turn, and as Barron began writing his first line of solution, no one, not even the professor, could predict what would unfold on that whiteboard. Students watched in stunned silence as Barron's hand moved across the board with practiced precision. Each step was clear, deliberate, and surprisingly elegant. But what truly caught everyone's attention wasn't just his solving of the problem. It was his running commentary. "This first step," he explained calmly, "uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. It simplifies what appears complex into something more approachable." His marker continued moving. Dr. Anderson's confident expression began to waver as she followed his work. Between steps, Barron paused briefly to ensure the entire class could follow his logic. It wasn't just about solving the problem. He was teaching it. Several students had pulled out their phones, recording his explanation. Even those who usually struggled with calculus found themselves understanding his approach. "Now," he said, reaching a crucial point in the solution, "we have two paths forward. The traditional method would take another full board, but there's a more elegant approach using Leibniz's original insights. Which would you prefer to see, Professor?" Dr. Anderson stood frozen. Her earlier smugness had completely evaporated. The question wasn't just about mathematical preference. It was a gentle reminder of the depth of knowledge she had tried to dismiss. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a hand shot up from the middle of the class. Could we see both?" asked Sarah Chin, one of the quieter students. "This is actually helping me understand last week's chapter better." Barron smiled warmly at Sarah, then looked questioningly at Dr. Anderson. The professor's response would reveal far more than her mathematical preference. It would show whether she could recognize when a teaching moment transcended her personal biases. Just as Dr. Anderson was about to respond, the classroom door burst open. Dean Richardson, a known ally of Dr. Anderson's political activism, strode in. "Linda, we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the new curriculum changes." The timing couldn't have been worse for Dr. Anderson. Or better, as she thought. "We'll have to continue this demonstration another time," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. But before she could step away, Barron spoke up. "Professor, you challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made even the dean pause. Walking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity. Students held their breath, recording on their phones, knowing they were witnessing a defining moment. Dr. Anderson started, then stopped. Her hand trembled as she looked at the complex equation she'd written. The very equation she'd chosen specifically to humiliate a student was now a sword hanging over her own head. "Perhaps," Barron offered graciously, "we could solve it together. Sometimes collaboration leads to better understanding." His tone held no mockery or triumph, only a genuine offer to transform this moment of conflict into something constructive. But Dr. Anderson's pride wouldn't let her accept the olive branch. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, throwing the marker down. "This entire display is nothing but a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The dean, sensing disaster, tried to intervene. "Let's all take a step back." "No," Barron said firmly, picking up the marker. "Let's take a step forward." He turned to the board and, in a display of mathematical virtuosity that left the room speechless, completed both solutions, the traditional method and Leibniz's approach, in under 5 minutes. As he wrote the final line, the class erupted in spontaneous applause. Even the dean couldn't hide his amazement. But what happened next would reshape the entire dynamic of not just this class, but the entire department. Dr. Anderson's face went from red to pale, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling before her eyes. The situation was about to spiral out of control, but once again, Barron stepped up. Walking to the door, he addressed the growing crowd. "If you're here because you want to learn," his voice carrying natural authority, "then come in. There's plenty of room." Students flooded in, filling every available space. Dr. Anderson watched in amazement as Barron turned back to the board, marker in hand. Now, he said, who wants to learn about the practical applications of calculus in the real world? Problem solving? Today, that calculus class stands as a reminder that true education isn't about power struggles or political agendas. It's about the pursuit of knowledge, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to do so with grace. And Barron Trump? He still sits in the back of the class, still helps struggling students, and still believes that the greatest privilege of all is the opportunity to learn and to help others do the same.